The sun was sinking slowly behind the dusty hills of Red Creek Valley, turning the sky into a burning canvas of orange and crimson. And Luke Carter stood alone beside the broken fence that marked the edge of his dying ranch, staring at the empty pasture that once held dozens of cattle, but now held nothing but dry grass and memories. The wind carried dust across the land like whispers of failure, and Luke felt every grain of it settle into the heavy silence in his chest. 3 years ago, this ranch had been alive with noise, horses stamping, cows lowing, and his little girl, Emma, laughing as she ran through the tall grass. But now the barns were quiet, the corrals empty, and the bank in town was already sharpening its teeth, waiting to swallow the last thing Luke had left. His boots scraped the dirt as he turned toward the house, the small wooden structure barely standing against years of prairie storms. And through the window he could see Emma sitting at the table with her legs swinging under the chair as she drew pictures on a scrap of paper, humming softly to herself like a bird that didn't yet know winter was coming. She was only 8 years old, small and bright-eyed, with her late mother's stubborn kindness shining in her smile, and Luke felt the familiar twist of guilt in his stomach because he knew he was failing her, no matter how hard he worked from dawn until nightfall. The ranch needed more hands, more strength, more money than he could ever find alone, and every neighbor he had already asked had given the same sympathetic shrug. Times were hard for everyone. No one could afford to help a man who was already sinking. Luke sighed and wiped sweat from his brow as he stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under his weight, when suddenly the distant rumble of wagon wheels broke the quiet valley air. At first, he thought it must be the supply wagon from town, but as he squinted toward the dusty road, he realized something strange. The wagon was larger than most and pulled by 2 powerful draft horses, and standing beside it like a towering shadow against the fading light was a woman unlike any he had ever seen. She was tall, shockingly tall, her broad shoulders wrapped in a dark traveling coat that fluttered in the wind, and even from the distance Luke could tell she carried herself with a strength that made the earth seem smaller beneath her boots. The wagon rolled slowly to a stop in front of the ranch house, and Emma rushed to the window with excitement while Luke stepped down from the porch, unsure whether to greet a stranger or prepare for trouble. The woman climbed down from the wagon in a single, steady movement that made the wooden step groan beneath her weight, and when she straightened to her full height, Luke realized she was at least a head taller than him, with strong arms that spoke of years of hard labor and a face weathered by grief, yet carved with a quiet dignity. Her dark hair was braided over one shoulder, and her gray eyes studied the ranch with a sharpness that made Luke feel as though she could see every crack in the barn walls and every worry hidden in his heart. For a long moment neither of them spoke, the prairie wind moving between them like an impatient witness, until the woman finally broke the silence with a voice deep and steady. "You must be Luke Carter," she said. Luke frowned slightly. "Depends who's asking." The woman stepped forward and removed her gloves, revealing large hands roughened by work, yet strangely graceful. "My name is Margaret Hale," she replied calmly, "and I've come a long way to make you a proposal." Emma pushed open the door and peeked out from behind her father's leg, staring up at the towering stranger with wide eyes, and Margaret's expression softened when she noticed the girl. "You have a daughter," she observed quietly. Luke nodded. "Emma." Margaret crouched slightly so she wouldn't seem so intimidating. Though even bent, she still seemed enormous compared to the child. "Hello, Emma," she said gently. Emma studied her for a moment before whispering, "You're really tall?" Margaret laughed softly, the sound warm and surprisingly kind. "Yes, I've heard that before." Luke cleared his throat, still confused. "You said you had a proposal." Margaret straightened again and looked him directly in the eye, her voice suddenly firm as iron. "I need a husband," she declared plainly, "and you need a strong daughter." Luke blinked, convinced he had misheard. "Excuse me." Margaret crossed her arms calmly. "I'm a widow," she continued. "My husband died 2 winters ago in a logging accident. Since then, I've been running my farm alone, I can manage the work, but the town council won't leave me be. They say a woman shouldn't own that much land without a man. They're already trying to take it." Luke rubbed his jaw, still unsure where this was going. "And what does that have to do with me?" Margaret gestured toward the empty pasture. "Your ranch is failing," she said bluntly, though there was no cruelty in her voice, only honesty. "You're one season away from losing everything." Luke stiffened, embarrassed but unable to deny it. Margaret continued, "I need a husband in name, so the council cannot take my land, and your daughter needs someone strong enough to help raise her when you cannot carry the world alone anymore." The words hung heavy in the air. Luke stared at her, stunned by the directness of it. "You rode all the way here just to suggest marriage?" he asked slowly. Margaret nodded once. "A partnership," she corrected. "Nothing more unless time decides otherwise." Emma tugged on Luke's sleeve and whispered, "She seems nice." Luke let out a quiet breath and looked again at the towering widow, standing confidently in his dusty yard. There was something about her presence, solid, fearless, almost immovable, like a mountain that made the chaos in his life feel strangely smaller. "Why me?" he asked finally. Margaret looked toward Emma again. "Because your daughter smiled at me the moment I arrived," she answered softly. "And a man who can raise a child that kind cannot be entirely broken." The wind stirred the dry grass around them, carrying the faint scent of rain from distant hills. And for the first time in months, Luke felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, not fear, not despair, but the fragile beginning of hope. He looked at Emma, who was already holding Margaret's enormous hand, as if she had known her forever, and then back at the woman whose bold declaration had just turned his. "Quiet evening upside down." "Well," Luke said slowly, scratching the back of his neck, "that might be the strangest proposal a man's ever gotten on this ranch." Margaret smiled slightly. "Strange times require honest solutions," and as the sun finally dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear above Red Creek Valley, Luke Carter realized that sometimes the future didn't arrive gently like a dream. It arrived in the form of a giant widow, stepping off a wagon and declaring, with fearless certainty, that two broken lives might be strong enough to build one new beginning together. And if you enjoy powerful frontier stories of courage, love, and second chances like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel and join us for the next unforgettable tale from the wild heart of the West, because the greatest stories are still waiting just beyond the horizon.